Today you'll receive unit notes for the Trade Routes, Africa, and the Americas unit. Let's look at an overview. We'll talk about these Central African kingdoms. We will talk about these Central American kingdoms. And then we will also be talking about how trade routes along these areas are going to increase cultural diffusion and cultural awareness across the world. Let's begin in Africa. As you know, Africa has a very diverse geography. Because of its savanna grasslands in the central part of Africa, cultures develop good farming techniques, and we'll talk a little bit more about the type of people that live there and how they influence the rest of Africa. We know that the routes across the Sahara Desert, the trans-Saharan trade routes, were long and difficult and required mainly the use of camels. We know that Africa had a lot of access to water, the Mediterranean, the Niger River flowing out into the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea are going to be really important trade routes off the coasts of Africa. We know that Africa also is populated with some intense rainforest areas, that's the purple here, and the blue. So we can see some rainforest areas along in Central and Eastern Africa. One group that you have to know living in Africa is the Bantu group. This is a group of farmers that have long populated this farming zone in Africa. And starting in the 1st century CE, so year 0 to year 100, they begin to move around and migrate throughout Africa, particularly as they go south and southeast. As they go, they spread farming techniques, particularly the use of iron as a farming tool. These tools are going to be very important in helping to build civilization and grow farming so that food surpluses can grow. One of the most important things besides their farming techniques that the Bantus spread with them is language. And so this is why today many people speak Swahili, because Swahili is the language that stems directly from the Bantu people's original language. So Swahili is spoken by many Africans in this part of Africa. One kingdom in the eastern or northeastern corner of Africa that you need to know about is Aksum. Aksum is a neighbor to Egypt, and it is where Ethiopia is today. It forms in the Ethiopian highlands, and it's right along the Nile River and the Red Sea. Many inhabitants of Aksum historically converted to Christianity by King Izana, and this was commemorated, and their war victories were commemorated by steles. So you can see an example of the steles in Aksum, which were erected to show that they were victorious in war. So remember, we've talked about some famous steles all year, like the one that the Hammurabi Code is written on. And so you have to be able to recognize those and know why they were erected. The other things that the Aksum people are known for, the kingdom of Aksum is known for its terraced farming. So those are when you have these step levels of farming, and it's often done in the mountains. Well, they're from the Ethiopian highlands, so that makes sense. We'll talk about that more when we get into South America. The Zimbabwe people are one of those people who were impacted by the Bantu migrations. Their civilization is down in the southeastern corner of Africa. They're in between the Zambezi and the Limpopo rivers and right along the Indian Ocean coast. The huge city of Great Zimbabwe is known for its walled, beautiful stone-walled city structure. They're round walls around the whole city, and even though it's not inhabited today, it's still standing and is a really important historic site. These people have impacted a lot of modern cultures and civilizations in Africa. Let's move on to West Africa. If we look at West Africa, there's a really important river that runs out to the Atlantic Ocean, and that is the Niger River. The Niger River is an important trade route, and it's also an important source for water in Africa just below the Sahara, called the Sub-Saharan area. And these three main kingdoms develop, and fortunately for you, they're in alphabetical order, from the order they appear to the order they die out, from their size, which one is smallest to which one is greatest, so that's a really nice mnemonic device. Ghana is first, Mali is second, and Songhai is third. You can see their time frames over here. These outlines show their size. So like I said, Ghana is definitely the smallest. These different kingdoms become very important for trade reasons across the sub-Saharan region, through both the Sahara and then out through the Niger River, linked into northern Africa and into across the Strait of Gibraltar here into Spain and other parts of Western Europe. We're going to see trade routes develop that are going to spread mainly salt and gold. Those are going to be the big trade items across this area of the world. And one major important cultural piece of diffusion that came through here is, of course, we know across North Africa, Islam spread, and that spread to this region of the world and eventually led these nations to become Islamic. Okay, this is a little bit more about the trans-Saharan trade routes. So as I've been talking about, these routes come across the Saharan desert thanks to the use of camels who are able to store water so that they themselves do not die, and then the humans have to store their own water as they're traveling. Timbuktu is a major center. You might have thought there was just a made-up city that's used as an example of a city far away, but it's actually a real city. Timbuktu is right here in Mali. It becomes a major center for learning and culture, and they had many libraries. It was a place where there were some important mosques that were built. And so as Islam continues to spread, those values of learning and storing literature, housing literature and knowledge is important in Africa as well as in the Middle East and in Europe. We see other trade routes develop that we've talked about already and some that we haven't talked about yet. We see the Silk Road spread some further goods to Europe, and then also, like I've been talking about, through northern Africa. We see textiles, those are cloths materials, paper, printing press we know traveled to Europe, the compass used for navigation, porcelain we've talked about, Buddhism and Islam, of course, we've already mentioned this year. Indian Ocean and South China Sea trade is also going to pick up during this time period when the Middle Ages are happening in Europe, and that is for the reason that people around the world start to desire spices. There's also some knowledge that's being shared. The lateen sail, you see over here a triangle-shaped sail, is going to improve sea navigation. Sugar, interestingly enough, sugar is not something that was regular in diets in Western Europe and in many other parts of the world, and that's introduced through the trade of sugarcane from the Indian Ocean region. And then, of course, we've talked about religious spread across the Indian Ocean. Northern and Western Europe are going to be interested in amber. We've learned about that this year. Cloth, and of course Christianity is going to travel around Northern and Western Europe as well as eastward and south toward Africa. So we've looked at some images of the Silk Road before, but just to remind you, it's not one road, it's a network trade route. And so the Silk Roads pass through some important cities and some important landmarks that we've talked about this year already. I just want to point out, here's Mecca with the Kaaba. We're in Africa talking about the Bantu folks. Here's Egypt. That's why we've got the Great Sphinx, as well as many other places in the Byzantine and in the Western Roman Empire. A view of the Indian Ocean and South China Sea trade routes, and a reminder of those monsoons that are in this ocean across India and across the rest of the South Indian Sea area. Let's move on to the Americas. So the Americas have some key civilizations that we'll touch on this year, but before we get there we need to look at their geography. The area that is called Mesoamerica, Central America, has a lot of rainforest, some plateau areas, that's highland area, that's flat, and some swampy areas. So they have a mixture of climate and a mixture of terrain. The Andes Mountains are going to be essential to the development of the Inca people in South America. And then there's also plenty of rainforest in South America too, along the Amazon River basin. The Mayan group is the first that we'll talk about. Mayan civilization forms in Central America, so where Mexico is today. This is called the Yucatan Peninsula, and it looks like a thumb sticking off of a thumbs up hand on Central America. So you can think of the Maya as being thumbs up group. As you look, you'll see there are a lot of rainforesty areas. If you flip back, you can see rainforest in the green zone. So we know that this is going to be a moist area, very tropical. All right, let's look at their civilization. Some important cities you need to know. Chichen Itza is probably their most famous city, as well as the city of Tikal. Their government are really city-states similar to what we've seen when we talked about Greece and when we talked about ancient Sumer. So we have city-states that are independent, and there's a priest-king over each of them. So they have what kind of government? You're right, it's a theocracy, because their king, they believe, is also an important part in their religion. We know that the Mayans were essentially based on their farming and local trade. They're not trading at an international level until the Europeans arrive in the 1400s. But we do see some really important developments in farming techniques. So I want to take a minute to talk about slash and burn. Slash and burn farming is essential to understanding this part of the world. If you live in a tropical area where there are a lot of trees, you need to replenish the soil and you need to make room for farming. So in order to do both those things at once, you can cut down trees, burn those trees, and it'll cause the nutrients to turn into ashes where they can be tilled back into the soil that's now cleared and open for farming. So slash and burn farming techniques are really important and are used to restore the soil, the nutrients in the soil. The belief system of these people were polytheistic and often had very bloody sacrifices to their gods. There are some advancements that you must know for the Mayans, including the calendar and the use of different advanced mathematics. And I'm sure that you will ask me if these are the people that thought the world was going to end in 2012. And no, they didn't think that, although some people in our Western civilization said they did. What happened is that the Mayans had a very complicated system for their calendar to reset every certain amount of years. So it was on a kind of a periodic calendar. And what happened was some Western thinkers, in looking at that, historians inaccurately thought that when that cycle reset, they didn't see it resetting and they thought it just was an end point in the Mayan calendar. So then they said, well, the Mayans thought the world was going to end. No, the Mayans just thought there was some major resetting of the calendar in the universe at that point. So not quite the end of the world. Let's talk about some of their architecture. So you've probably seen some of these beautiful sites at Chichen Itza, these amazing pyramid-like temples and these huge carvings with these amazing intricate designs. This is also from a game that was played. I'm sure at some point you've heard about it or studied what people, historians and different thinkers project onto this, what they think might be happen, were sacrifices of heads used as the ball. We don't know, but they look kind of like basketball courts. All right, moving on to the Aztec. Aztec people are also in what is Mexico today, but they are not on the Yucatan Peninsula, the thumb. They're actually in central Mexico. So these folks live in much more of kind of a swampy area, and because of that they had to fill in some of their land, their swamp land, in order to build cities. The most famous city is Tenochtitlan, and we will talk about how they were able to farm. It's pretty amazing. But before we do that, let's talk about their government. They are ruled by an emperor, and they are an empire. So this is a government where there are many cities or states you could look at who fall under one government, but they are spread out over a large region. if the Aztecs took over other people groups, other neighbors, then those people groups had to pay tribute in either money or sending workers to work for the empire. Now, let's talk about their agriculture, because again, just like the Mayan, their economy is based on agriculture and local trade. Their farming technique is amazing. They used floating gardens. So you see that in this picture here. They built these gardens on little floating, kind of like floating docks, and they would sow them with sod, put down a lot of dirt, and then plant seeds on them, and those seeds would spring up into these beautiful gardens, and then they would kind of garden them as they were out floating around the lake. So pretty amazing technique. This is called chinampas farming. Chinampas, you must know about that. These two, the Aztecs, are polytheistic. They also practice bloody sacrifices, and they also build incredible temples to their gods. Also, they are known for their calendar, their mathematics. These guys have glyphs, and they use, like we're showing you in the picture here, they use canals. Do you remember a glyph is a symbol used in written language? The Mayans had written language too, although they didn't have specific glyphs in the same way that the Aztecs did. So here's an example of an Aztec calendar. You can see how detailed it is. All right, an image for you of an Aztec city. And here's an aerial view of what Tenochtitlan may have looked like, a city on a lake. Today, Mexico City is in very much basically the same location, and is sitting on top of what was once swampland that has been filled in by humans. These Aztec pyramid temples are incredibly enormous, and I include this picture because I think it helps you visualize just how big they are. Look at those steps all the way to the top. Amazing. Huge. And another image for you here. All right, final civilization that we'll talk about in the Americas is the Inca. The Inca live in the part of western South America that is populated by the Andes Mountains. The Andes Mountains are huge mountains. They are very rocky, very snow-covered, and very, very difficult terrain to live in. But we'll talk about how the Inca are able to survive anyway. Their most important city that you need to know is Machu Picchu, but you should be familiar with the name Cusco as well. Their government is also an empire, just like the Aztecs, and they have an emperor, and they also have a government that is below that. So they pretty much have a bureaucracy. They've got a multi-level government. They use agriculture. It's at a high level, high altitude, and so we'll talk about the kind of farming they practice there. And they also practice perhaps more long-distance trade than the other two. In order to go to neighbors who have the goods that they need, they have to go a little bit farther. Now, the kind of farming that they practice is terraced farming. Do you remember that picture way at the beginning that I was showing you in Africa with Aksum? Well, similar kind of farming is going to happen with the Inca. They carve steps into the sides of the mountains, and then once they have those level steps, then they plant on top of the leveled steps. Make sure that they're able to farm even though their land is very difficult. They are polytheistic as well. They also practice sacrifices, and they also have elaborate temples. Perhaps you're seeing a lot of similarities between these three civilizations. Unlike the other two civilizations, they, however, in the Andes have to develop some differences. They have a lot of roads because their empire is so big and it's so mountainous. They have to be connected by a system of regularly used roads that are kept by the government. One thing they do is build suspension bridges, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, that cross these incredible canyons and gorges. They build these bridges from grass and are able to, by the time they're finished building them, carry huge heavy loads across them by building these incredibly strong ropes. They're pretty amazing. They also used calendars, and had a system of mathematics. And like the other two, they did have a type of written communication system, although it wasn't a written language like we think of. It's called a quipu, and quipus are a system of colored cords or strings that are knotted in particular ways to have different meanings. So this is one way that messages could be carried across the empire. This system was used throughout the Incan Empire. So this, one colored knotted cord in a certain way would have one meaning. Another color knotted in a different way would have a different meaning. So that's the Inca. Here are some pictures of the Inca. This is Machu Picchu, that most famous site. And you can see those terraces right along here. They're really flat and green because they're getting sunlight. But you can imagine that farming on this type of hilltop would be really intimidating. This is one of those rope bridges that stretches across a gorge. You can see these are really, really thick ropes, and they would be very, very strong and last a long time, but they began with just blades of grass like you see right down here. Pretty amazing. Okay, that's it for your notes. Please make sure you've completed everything for your teacher's class.